This is the moment for a welcome address from the Rector of the University of Modena, Emilia, Professor Carlo of Porro, and after the brief presentation of the conference, so please.
Thank you, Tommaso. Dear authorities, dear Marina, dear Paola, dear colleagues and guests, I'm very pleased to welcome you in Modena on my own behalf and on behalf of the entire University of Modena and Reggio Emilia. First, I would like to thank the Marco Biagi Foundation, its director, all its staff, for the great scientific rigor featured in organizing this international convention. For years, a fundamental place for debate and discussion on priority issues for our country, as well as for Europe and the international context. This is a very appropriate way to continue, so to speak, the dialogue with Professor Marco Biagi, a great colleague who has contributed throughout his academic life to improving the conditions of workers and, more generally, of the most vulnerable people through his enlightened and far-sighted action. Through its valuable work, the Marco Biagi Foundation has been contributing to the transition to a quality labor market, in which the concept of full employability features a just and inclusive society, as Professor Biagi maintained. Turning to the focus of the conference, it is worth recalling how the health emergency caused by the COVID-19 outbreak has been responsible for an unprecedented impact on our country and our territory, and has involved, in addition to a global health crisis, important economic and social implications with profound effects for many countries worldwide. This terrible and unexpected situation has obviously led to a general reduction in the employment rate, specifically women, young people, workers on temporary contracts, and those on lower wages were the hardest hit. Indeed, the main objectives of the many acts adopted to the benefit of the labor market were precisely aimed at encouraging interaction, integration, or reintegration of these people. The funds invested have mainly targeted social inclusion, trying to counter the effects of the pandemic with regard to the gender gap and the conditions of young people. In the spirit of great changes on the future, not only of work, but of the very concept of the social pact that regulates and defines our civil coexistence, Unimore has chosen not to wait on the sidelines, but to question and reflect, networking the multidisciplinary skills and knowledge existing within our university. We strongly felt the duty to carry out a scientific analysis allowing to lead to a collective and common knowledge of the issues that emerged, and at the same time provide a reference scenario of measures and actions to be taken within a constant dialogue with all the institutions. The idea of activating the intellectual and professional resources available at Unimore gave rise to a table for discussion on issues related to the pandemic emergency, composed of scholars who could ensure professional competence and seriousness internationally acknowledged. The goal, therefore, was not of a simple scientific dissemination, but to generate an academically accredited and understandable reflection on more than one level, addressed not only to the scientific community, but to the whole society. In the wake of what is defined as the third mission of the university, alongside teaching and research, results were collected in a publication that was discussed and made available within a public service approach that the University of Modena Reggio Emilia daily puts into practice. This methodological work has also enabled our university to chart the course for the near future, outside the emergency context, to contribute to the well-being and development of the community through the production of knowledge made possible by research, the development of the applications derived from it, and the transmission of this knowledge to the new generations and more generally to society through higher training activities. The theme of higher training is generally accompanied in a dominant way by lifelong learning, which since the 19th of the last century has become increasingly important, forming the core of the training policies of the European Union. In this regard, too, our university intends to develop a substantial strengthening of postgraduate training and the overall teaching proposal that can accompany the professional life of people through a continuous updating of skills. It is highly desirable that the potential gain during this pandemic crisis should not be analyzed only in the temporary wake of the emergency, as already said, but rather within a long-term perspective in order not to disperse knowledge and skills gained so far. We need long thoughts that foster a more just world and keep up with the needs of all people, starting with work and social contexts. I intentionally use the word world. Our University of Modena Reggio Emilia, together with 64 other universities, joins the network of Italian Universities for Peace. It is an initiative promoted by the Italian Conference of Universities Rectors, aiming to strengthen our university's commitment to building peaceful societies. It is precisely for these reasons that we hope that a ceasefire is reached in Ukraine as soon as possible and that lasting agreements are signed through diplomatic relations. We strive for a world without wars that knows how to solve conflicts practicing, as Marco Biagi taught us, all the means of dialogue, confrontation, and institutional relations. Thank you.
The topic of this year's conference, Work Beyond the Pandemic Towards a Human-Centered Recovery, reflects not only a research goal, but also an axiological standing taken by the Foundation Scientific Committee. The pandemic operated as a magnifying lens and an accelerator of the critical issues and the dynamics that were already present in the society, in the economy, and in the labor markets. On the other hand, COVID-19 represented an opportunity to test extraordinary and sometimes innovative measures aimed at preserving cohesion and stability in an era of structural risk and new vulnerabilities. So when we designed this conference and drafted the call for papers, we pursued the idea of calling on the academic community to undertake a critical analysis on the future of work from our usual interdisciplinary perspective that encompasses law, organization theory, and economics. The goal of this conference, therefore, is not only and not mainly to reflect retrospectively on the state of employment relations throughout the pandemic period, but to understand whether and how the lessons learned from the pandemic will drive policymakers, social partners, and all the players of employment relations towards a new economic and social model that puts the human being at its center. The response from the scholarly community has been, as usual, positive beyond our expectations. We have been able to put together almost 60 speakers from Italy, Europe, and overseas, who will discuss some of the central aspects of the current debate on transitions and recovery strategies: sustainability, social rights, new forms of work, the changing patterns in the organization of work, occupational health and safety, and well-being. When their conference will be finished tomorrow afternoon at 4:30, some of his closest friends and colleagues will commemorate Marco Biagi on the 20th anniversary of his homicide. I now invite Manfred Weiss to take the lead for the opening session. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, dear colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to chair this opening session, and it's my special pleasure to be here together with all the others. Isn't it wonderful that we can come together again after this terrible period where we only had virtual communication? I think this is a sort of revitalization, and we should be joyful for this, that we can experience it again. In this first session, we will have 5 contributions, all variations of the main topic of this conference. And we have a sort of difficulty because, as you can see, we only have 3 chairs here. Because of the distance, you know, we can come together, but COVID is not yet over. So we have to be cautious, as you can see, and you still are wearing the masks, which is good. So what we are going to do is the following. As you can see, the first 2 speakers already are sitting next to me. And once they are through, I'll ask the next speakers, and they will come here, and you have to leave your seats. The next thing I have to tell you is we have to make sure that we are remaining in the time frame. We are already a little bit behind, but that's not important. We have 90 minutes, and I would like to have in the very end a little bit of this space for discussion. So my suggestion, and if I say suggestion, it means if I say it, order. To my speakers here is to please only speak a maximum of 15 minutes. Is that okay? Well, we try. I'll be rigid as normally. You know me as a very authoritarian person, you know. Okay, we will have different topics. I just indicate them briefly, very briefly. Emanuele Menegatti will start by talking about minimum wage, minimum income. He will tell you in detail what he means by this. Then Chiara Mussida will speak about organizing of work, focusing on poverty and vulnerable workers, isn't it? Then we will hear Silvia Profili, and she will talk about workplace inclusion. Then we will hear Riccardo Salomone, and Riccardo Salomone will speak about the role of the public employment agencies in fighting unemployment. And finally, we will hear Iacopo Senatore, and he will speak about the role of social dialogue in promoting sustainable employment. I will not say anything about the speakers because you can read that in the website, and we have to save time here. Therefore, I stop now, and I give the floor to Emanuele Menegatti. The floor is yours.
Okay, the presentation should start. This doesn't count. 15 minutes.
Okay. This kind of technology, you know, it's always the same.
Okay. Can I?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much for having me here to the scientific committee, for inviting me. I go straight forward into the presentation, and the purpose of my presentation is to make use of some of the useful indication we got from the experiments of income support during the pandemic to speculate on the question, is it time for universal and unconditional protection for household incomes? And I will just try to provide some hints for discussion. I'm not answering this question properly because for a lawyer alone it's almost possible to provide an answer to this very difficult question. So, as for the pandemic, okay, this one is not working. Okay, not my fault.
Never use PowerPoint, has neither power nor a point.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so the impact of the pandemic on poverty, as you can see from in the graph about the EU, has been huge, of course. However, as the graph about the poverty rate in the US shows, by a massive use of social transfer, many governments, including the US government and many other governments, basically, they managed to contain the poverty. Of course, now it's growing again, but the point is the experience of the pandemic gave us the opportunity to rethink perhaps the strategies to combat poverty. And again, no. Okay. So the point is, so far, we have been used to consider work as the main means for social inclusion, and so to target social protection accordingly to those who are not able to work, mostly by social insurance. And this mostly reflects the work-centered ethic of the 20th century. However, work is no longer for all. Okay, but I cannot use the animation this way. No. No, because in this way I lost all the animation.
I cannot help, I'm a technological idiot.
Okay.
If we go on like this, we will need an extra hour. What is happening? Don't ask me. I know nothing about this.
Okay, now it's working. Okay, so I said, we used to consider work as the main means for social inclusion, and of course income support was targeted on those unable to work. However, work is no longer for all, especially in the wake of the digital revolution. what we have been seeing recently is the jobless economic growth, giving rise to a large gray area of people and workers in need, but not covered or not fully covered by social assistance, especially for the category of the so-called working poor, with overrepresentation here of self-employed. And the economic shocks generated by the pandemic forced governments to adapt social assistance schemes in order to make them more accessible and also the payment faster. The point is, since we learned that the economic shocks are recurrent, perhaps it's high time we realize that the work-centered systems of income support are no longer appropriate to the current drivers of poverty, and perhaps it's time we move towards simpler and more universal systems. Overall, the idea is that of moving from a combination between the right to work, so the work as main means for social inclusion, as I said, combined with social insurance, towards more inclusive schemes of income support based on social transfer. In order to elaborate on that idea, let me start by considering the drivers of poverty. I split it here in work population and out of work population. And as for in work population, the drivers of poverty are rather varied, starting from inadequate minimum wages. However, perhaps the most relevant factor are the insufficient number of working hours for many workers, mainly because the increasing precarization and casualization of work. The household composition, we have here a failure of the single breadwinner model. And social protection targeted on work are perhaps unable to cope with the new phase of poverty, and in particular in work poverty. For out-of-work population, explanation of poverty is much easier. The lack of employment opportunities is, of course, the main driver. And again, here, social protection is not able to cope with this situation. The policies are rather different. Adjusting wages to the cost of living is, of course, a way for providing adequate minimum wages. Strategies to tackle precarious work, especially work which is located beyond the boundaries of the traditional employment, is something important. Labor market policies are, of course, important to cope with structural unemployment. And that's precisely the focus of my presentation, by improving social transfer, so non-contributory schemes of social assistance, we can perhaps lift the income of household above the threshold of poverty. So the tools I'm looking at are the two main tools, guaranteed minimum income, which can take the form of in-work support, and the radical idea of the universal basic income. Starting from the guaranteed minimum income, which is simply a cash transfer aimed at providing the working age households with enough income to prevent poverty. Normally this instrument is means tested, so the benefits levels are typically determined by comparing the household needs, mainly the household composition, with the household means, so the income from work and assets. Very often the means tested is also connected to a conditionality, so the benefits are conditional, the subsidies are conditional on availability for work, training programs, community services. So, in short, a measure for active inclusion of people. The problem, because of the means-tested nature of the subsidies, you see, here, it can result in strong work disincentives and incentives to undeclared work. We are very familiar with this in Italy, since we have a kind of guaranteed minimum income. And if one takes up a job, he can lose totally or proportionally the subsidy. And considering the costs related to work, so cost for transfers, cost for food, for children care, of course, the workers may prefer to refuse the job and retain the subsidy. To overcome these incentives, it's possible to combine out-of-work subsidies with net income support, and this could take the form of a negative income tax, so basically a tax credit, which works the other way around of the guaranteed minimum income, in the sense that the tax credit, so the benefits, increases alongside the earned income up to a certain point, then it stabilizes and then it decreases again. These schemes are common in some places like the US earned tax income credit or UK universal credit, or even in France the prime d'activité. So those schemes are able to provide an income which is competitive compared to the out-of-work benefits, and it should be considered on the household composition, and overall it should be combined with adequate minimum wages. Otherwise, the problem is that employers may lower wages and basically benefit of the income integration in place of the workers. We can, as last chance, forget about work incentives, detach social assistance from work, and so think about a universal basic income, which is a cash transfer given to a specific political community without condition, but to be part of the community. It's a fascinating 500 years old idea. Perhaps the moral arguments are rather robust, so it's a matter of sharing the profits resulting from exploitation of privatized common goods. As far as I know, there is only one example of really universal basic income in the world, which is the one in Alaska, where the basic income is financed by the oil revenue. But there have been other experiments, but no one really about unconditional universal income. Let's look at the pros and the cons, and I'm concluding on this on a more practical way to see whether this idea can be convenient or not. I included a couple of comic strips in order that are able to sum up the pros and the cons in a nutshell. So basically, this is about the pros. Enjoy, not too much because time is tight. And this is about the cons. Okay, so basically, more seriously, as for the pros you see here, universal basic income can be a compensation of the impact of automation and so overcome the structural lack of employment. It's a way for promoting individual freedoms, so people may be able to refuse bad jobs, so low-paid jobs or precarious jobs or jobs that are simply not in line with the skills of people. And they can engage in also in non-market related activities, so they could be able to contribute to the progress of society. It's simpler, cheaper, faster to manage than all the plethora, all the tools of social assistance we have now. As for the cons, first of all, it's very, very, very expensive. Estimates are breathtaking. For example, in Italy, if we want to give like 500 euros per person, it would cost 20% of our GDP. So the figures are impressive. However, we need to consider that it would replace most, if not all, of other social assistance schemes. And also being not means tested, it would entail a dramatic reduction of the costs that are involved in the verification of the requirements for the current benefits. However, I'm not sure that that could be enough to compensate the cost of a universal basic income. So perhaps a selection of the beneficiary is always necessary, and this is what happened, for example, during the pandemic when we had this cash transfer made by the government. Second, it's difficult to find enough political support for pass such a legislation. And third, it reduces the incentives to work, creating this benefit dependence. Again, you see here, and I'm concluding, the well-established idea that work should be considered the main means for social inclusion, being also a kind of moral obligation for people, is perhaps the main obstacle toward a paradigm shift towards an unconditional right to income. And let me conclude from where I started. Is it time for unconditional and universal social protection for income? Well, I personally tend to hate lazy people. So if you had asked me before I prepared this presentation, I would say, no, that's a very bad idea. But when I finished preparing this presentation, I almost changed my mind, not about lazy people, still hate them, but basically I opened up my mind to the idea that perhaps universal protection could be a good idea, even if some selectivity is necessary to make it sustainable. If you are open to this idea, perhaps my presentation work. Otherwise, I failed, but I'd like to thank you anyway for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emanuele. First of all, for having kept the time wonderfully, and secondly, for having shown us the complexity of organizing minimum income for people. That's not so easy, as we have seen. Now, the floor is to Silvia Mussida. Sorry, to Chiara. Oh, I'm sorry. The first name's Mussida, and the floor is yours. You get along with the technology?
I don't know. I have the presentation, but... okay. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here in presence with you. And in this talk, I will focus on the trend and the evolution shortly of the labor market, mainly associated with the recent COVID-19 pandemic and social exclusion in terms of a specific category, also sketched in the first presentation, that is the one of working poor, in work poverty. The how does it? Okay, no, I'm here. This is the agenda of the presentation. I will give you some recent trends and evolution on the labor market, and then about social exclusion, because with the pandemic, some and important issues associated with social exclusion emerged, and especially associated with the working poor category. The definition of this category, and given the importance of this category, the literature and the empirical evidence available tried to sketch the main factors affecting in-work poverty, and then some conclusion. Labor market. We know that with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an important demand and supply shock on the labor market, and that important and urgent and immediate containment measures were introduced. We know that the employment and especially the total hours worked declined, and on the other side, we know as well that the unemployment increased, but not that much, probably because of the mentioned government intervention. And the labor market was most strongly affected, as said, by a reduction in average hours worked. And the government intervention included a lot of, in all European countries, especially job retention scheme, We know about short-time work and temporary layoff, and this affected the main labor market development. And this important job retention scheme helped to explain the adjustment to the pandemic by using the reduction of average hours worked instead of an increased unemployment. However, at the end of 2020, the labor market was still in a slack. Another important issue that I want to mention here, since the title of this conference is working after the pandemic, beyond the pandemic, and the most important effect on the way of working was an increase in the working from home, teleworking, and there was an important shift from office to teleworking. Despite there was an opportunity to working from home before the pandemic at about the 33%, the teleworking was not so common. Okay, before the pandemic, only 3.3% of employees worked from home or remotely. And with the lockdown, at the beginning of the pandemic, things changed and teleworking became more important. But there's a but. We know that teleworking affects not all sectors, not all workers, especially high-skilled workers. However, this has important implication also for the future, because teleworking became a concrete opportunity, especially for some sector and for some workers. And maybe also an important way of increasing the use of digital technology and accelerating the ongoing digital transformation. An important question that I try to answer in a paper that I'm not going to go here, but is if working from home should be an opportunity for some working category. Maybe for the working category that need to reconcile paid and unpaid work. Then in a study, with some estimation and a technique applied, the result was very interesting because for women, on the one hand, working from home at the beginning of the pandemic with the lockdown was an obstacle for the reconciliation, but it became as an opportunity for the future to better organize labor and paid work and care opportunities. So the pandemic affected the way of working and may be an opportunity. This is a general picture of the labor market. These are the latest data from the Eurostat. Here we have a schematic representation of the labor market in 3 states. And these are data for the 3rd and 4th quarter of 2021. And what we can see is that in the EU, inactivity is still important, and as well as it is important to understand what are the main characteristics of the labor market states and its transitions. Here we see such percentages. What are such percentages? On the main diagonal, we see the persistence in the labor market states, again in the quarter mentioned, and what we can see is an important persistence in inactivity. But this is the worst news. The good news is that at least at the end of 2021, there were important signals of recovery. As we can see, for instance, the transition from unemployment to employment were about 24.6%. But it is important also to understand, in terms of labor market, what is the composition of the outflows from unemployment. Why? As we can see in this graph, here again you see data from the Eurostat for all European countries. What I want to say here, I want to say that the outflows from unemployment are very heterogeneous across country, and it is important to study this composition because based on the main prevalence, we can arrange the more appropriate policy implications. For instance, in Italy, we see that the blue component, that is the one, the outflows from to inactivity, is very important. So many people became detached from the labor market. On the other side, we see countries in which there were important inflows into employment. For instance, here we can see Greece or other countries. And so what is important to understand? What is the composition of employment? The composition of employment after the pandemic changed a bit, and there was an increase at the European level of the share of low-paid, low-skilled, precarious workers, and the erosion of traditional collective bargaining structures. And the important fact was the increase of the number of employed people at risk of poverty. The amount, the proportion of working poor was relatively high. In the euro area, the latest percentage is about 9%. Who are the working poor? This is an important concept. We know this, and it's a combination of two important concepts, work and poor. Work is an individual definition, and an individual is working if he has been working for over half of the year. Poor, who is poor? As it was already defined, this is a more household level definition. It deals with the household income below a certain poverty threshold, the 60% of the national household median disposable income. So we have a combination of two important definitions, and problems associated with this definition. Why? Because sometimes we know that maybe that there's a woman working in bad condition in a precarious job who is individually working in bad condition, but maybe that she is not classified as working poor because she is in a household with a relatively high income. So the working poor is an important concept, but there are important issues to understand, to analyze completely this phenomenon. This is the relevance of working poor, the latest data from the Eurostat. Here we can see at the bottom of the graph the European Union with the 8.8%, Italy, which exceed this percentage of 2 percentage points, 8.8. Important percentages again in Romania, in Luxembourg, Estonia, and Bulgaria. Other countries instead with relatively low percentages or rates, like Finland, Czechia, and Belgium. But it's very important to understand the characteristics of this phenomenon. The literature started to study this phenomenon. I'm not going into the literature now, but there are a lot of papers on this. I'm mentioning this just few. But they try to understand the determinants of in-work poverty, and they classify the determinants in three categories: individual, household, and institutional characteristics. Individual, the most important role is for the education. Okay, we will see that there's an inverse correlation, a negative correlation between the level of education and the risk of being a working poor. Gender, okay, but we know that there's a problem with the definition, so the evidence is mixed, okay, and age. In this graph, we see the important role of education. This is a graph in an elaboration on the EU Silk data in 2014, okay? And here we can see that primary educated individuals are the most disadvantaged, especially in some countries. With the only exception of Finland, the first country we see here, in the other countries there's an important disadvantage for low educated. So the role of education for policymakers. Household factor, I'm not going into the detail, I don't have time, but it is important to see the contract type, so again, the quality of the employment. In this graph, we see, again, from the EU Silk data, that the prevalence of working poor is for part-time jobs, for involuntary part-time, self-employed without employee, and temporary contract. So it's a relevant and an important issue. Institutional factor, we can mention wage decentralization, minimum wage legislation, as already mentioned before, but another important issue is the last one, the access to services such as child care and training, so also welfare intervention. What can we conclude? We can conclude that, as we know, the COVID-19 affected importantly the labor market, and some category became marginalized from the labor market and from the economy as a whole. Work poverty increases its relevance, and this suggests that having a job, so being employed as classified by the institution, is no longer enough to ensure a decent standard of living. This is due to the quality of employment, because, as we said, the spread of precarious jobs, low-paid jobs, and occupation implied that the labor market has stopped being a stable source of prosperity for many households. So there's an important call, especially after the pandemic, for policy intervention to improve the quality of jobs and against the risk of poverty, both at the individual and household level. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chiara, for having given us a very, very interesting picture, not only of the amount of unemployment, but in particular of the composition and of the factors leading to unemployment. Now, Silvia, it's your turn, and Riccardo, you already can come over. I'm here. You are here. Okay. You can do here or you're there, wherever you like. Do you get along with the technology?
We will see.
And when you still have 2 minutes, I do this.
Okay. Okay, here we are.
Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you so much. Thanks to Ilenia and to Tommaso for inviting me. I do my research in the field of human resource management and organizational behavior. So I'm going to bring today a slightly different perspective on how the pandemic affected human resource management and will affect still in the future. Of course, this crisis brought many implications. First of all, in terms of flexibility, a new concept of flexibility went in, and basically new ways of working are now a reality, okay? So this crisis accelerated, as Tommaso said, existing trends in this field. Relatedly, new leadership style and supervisory behaviors are required, especially especially as a consequence of a more dispersed workforce. Many jobs have to be redesigned and have been transformed, especially the ones who require higher level of proximity, and also new skills are needed, and just to the importance of emotional and social skills. And these changes, and you are going during the conference to discuss on many of these challenges, for sure are going to change profoundly the way people will be managed, and also organizations will be managed. But I think that, at least in my perspective, one of the main one of the main change that the crisis somehow brought in is related to the concept of vulnerability. So this crisis put a new focus on vulnerability. Vulnerable comes from the Latin word vulnus, so meaning to wound. So vulnerable workers, in particular, are a broad group of people who are at risk of being wounded at work. So who are at risk, a higher risk as compared to others, of being abused, being exploited, being wounded at work. And there will be a very nice session this afternoon on this topic, talking about, addressing the protections needed to take care of vulnerable workers. Of course, there are scholars that are already addressing this issue, also from an organizational behavior and human resource management perspective, although they are mainly focused, these studies, at least so far, are mainly focused on disabilities, workers with disabilities, and more recently on LGBT employees. Other groups of workers having any kind of vulnerabilities are mainly understudied, and their experience of work have been overlooked in top HRM and organizational behavioral journals. Let's think about refugees or victims of abuse, or people having an illness or a chronic disease, so a long-lasting illness. And I'm going to focus in the next minutes of my presentation on this last group, so namely chronically ill workers. And I will spend just a couple of minutes to say why, according to me, not only to me, obviously, this is important. So why it's important to focus on this group of workers, on this group of vulnerable workers. In Italy, 41% of the population is affected by at least one chronic disease, and these are Istat data of 2020. And according to Eurofound, in 2017, chronically ill workers, okay, so not the population, workers, summed up to a quarter of the total European population. This proportion increased by 8% between 2010 and 2017, and is going to rise further in the future because of the aging of population, of course, because we know that chronic diseases are more frequent among older workers, and also thanks to the improvements in the treatment of many severe illnesses. Accordingly, chronically ill workers can be considered as the fastest growing and among the largest minority segments at work all around the world. So this is not something that has to do only with developed countries. From an organizational perspective, these data show that companies, organizations, institutions need to manage a large amount of workers who are affected or will probably be affected in the future by a chronic disease. Although today most of these organizations are totally unaware of this issue and are totally unprepared to face this challenge. What are the main characteristics of these workers, of chronically ill workers? So let's say something about the characteristics of chronic illness. First of all, they are of long duration and slow progression. Symptoms of these illnesses are often totally invisible, and they are variable in their severity and progression rate. And most importantly, at least from a people management perspective, they have oscillatory progression. So we can have peaks and periods of respite that might occur on a daily basis. So these features distinguish chronic illness from disability. As first of all, not all chronically ill workers develop a disability, and vice versa. And in some sense, this places the ill employee, the ill worker, in a sort of gray zone, being totally healthy and able in some period, while having important disability in other periods. By acknowledging these differences, one should recognize that workers with a chronic disease can have needs and expectations that are different, although related to those workers with a disability, and therefore should look into these needs and expectations. I had the chance in the last years to take part to a broad research project that was sponsored by an Italian private foundation, Fondazione Lavoro per la Persona, and the objective was and is to investigate the experience at work of employees with chronic illnesses, and also to identify the main challenges and barriers that these workers face at work. We involved two large Italian companies so far, involving both white and blue collar workers, and one distinctive feature of our study is that we adopted multiple and complementary perspectives, as we not only collected data and information on chronically ill employees' perceptions, but also on their co-workers, their supervisors, and their HR professionals, in order to have a more broad frame of this issue. And we use both qualitative and quantitative research methods, so using online surveys, but also interviews and focus group. And this is the final sample of our study. I will show only some preliminary results coming from one of the two field studies. So I will introduce just some themes that emerge from our analysis. One important evidence is related to disclosure. Disclosure is the act of revealing personal information about oneself to another. In this case, of course, we are talking about information about our health status. We found that almost 2 out of 10 workers did not disclose their health problem at work. And the ones who decided to disclose tended to inform their supervisors and their co-workers, while less frequently they went talking to their HR professionals, so informed the HR department. And also importantly, we found that the decision not to disclose the illness was influenced by the need to protect from stigma. So stigma is really a problem, that is an issue that is affecting these workers' behaviors, and also by the fear of being discriminated against in terms of personal development and career within the company. As a large number of chronic illness are, as I said, hidden and totally invisible to others, this means that many workers with poor health basically are silenced within this company, invisible to the organization, and probably are going to lack support from whoever, from their supervisors, co-workers, or from the HR department. We also explored chronically ill workers' perceptions of chronically ill diversity climate. What is diversity climate on the field of illness? It's employees' perceptions of the organization as being fair, inclusive, and respectful towards all employees, regardless of their illness. what we found is that only 4 out of 10 workers perceive a positive chronic illness diversity climate. And also in line with our theoretical expectation, we found that when chronically ill workers perceive to be treated unfairly by the company, by the organization, because of their illness, they tend to be less effectively committed to the organization and also to have higher level of work-related stress. This suggests that organizations should devote greater attention to foster positive perceptions of illness-related treatment at work. Next, our results also show that 1 out of 10 of these vulnerable workers feel to have been discriminated against because of the illness. Perceived discrimination is the behavioral component of illness bias, and of course represent another important stressor that negatively affect workers' positive behaviors and also their well-being and ultimately their performance at work. Another interesting thing that emerged from our qualitative analysis is the condition of liminality experienced by these workers. Liminality refers to a transitory transformational state during which an individual moves from one identity state or role to another. So it's often described as a period of in-betweenness, ambiguity and uncertainty, and as such can be very painful and also disruptive for individuals. Several chronically ill employees were, let's say, experienced during their illness a change in their work role, in their responsibilities, given the decrease in some of their abilities, or more than decreased change in their abilities and motivation. And of course, these changes involved the process of identity reconstruction as having a before and an after identity within the company. And this was particularly evident for employees who decided to telework, okay? So teleworking somehow put them in a sort of periphery of the organization. Last evidence are related to the effect of different human resource management practices on work engagement. Work engagement is a very important outcome because it's related to the dedication, the energy that we put into work. So how much we are committed, how much we find meaning at work and also view work as a challenge. And it's something that it's seldom explored among people with vulnerabilities. Although I think it's very important.
What is going on?
Okay, what we found is that while development and utilization practice, so all that have to do with career and upward progression and lateral movements were positively related to work engagement of these employees, on the other side, accommodative practice, such as reduced workload and additional leave, were negatively associated to work engagement. So they were somehow signaling the employees that they have to withdraw their energy and their resources from work. So organizations should be very cautious in using and introducing this kind of practice extensively within the organization, while maintenance practices were not having any kind of effect on work engagement, because probably they affect more extensively other kind of outcomes such
Silvia,
as
please come to an end.
or return to work. Okay, just come to the conclusion. You will read the conclusion. I'm not going to conclude because there's nothing to conclude, basically, because this field is really open. It's open. We are at the beginning of our research, and only my, let's say that I really hope that more and more scholars, at least in the field of human resource management, are going to address this topic, because there are really a lot of means for addressing vulnerability of work from this perspective, and I'm sure that this conference is going to contribute to this end. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Silvia, for having shown us this very big hidden group. Why do I say hidden group? Well, because we heard that the big problem is disclosure for all kind of reasons, you know. Thank you very much. Now, the next one will be Riccardo Salomone. He's already here.
Oh,
you stay there.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Manfred. I'd like to thank the Marco Biagi Foundation for the invitation and the opportunity to contribute to the discussion today. It's a pleasure for me to take the floor at this opening session of the 19th conference in commemoration of Professor Marco Biagi. I was here 10 years ago when we discussed Marco's legacies regarding methods of comparative law to provide both critical insights and an overview of trends and different solutions in national labor laws, industrial relations systems, and reforms in the field of European integration. And I was here in Modena actually more than 20 years ago as a PhD student like you, discussing my research topic with Marco. To be accurate, the very first time I met Marco, 1999, we were in Bologna at the train station, starting together a commuting trip to Modena. That day, he taught me a couple of things I didn't forget. Originally, I was from the School of Law of the University of Bologna, the Alma Mater Studiorum. So, good morning, Professor Biagi. Delighted to meet you. Come on, Riccardo. Let's be informal. We both are Bolognese. We both are comparative lawyers in a way. Please, I'm Marco. The first thing he taught me is to deal with things realistically, in a way that is based on practical rather than theoretical consideration. In other words, the importance of being quick and pragmatic in research as well as in academic life. 10 minutes later, we were on the local train somewhere between Anzola and Castelfranco Emilia, looking out the window when Marco said, "And here's my Ferrari." Ferrari? Really? Where? I was quite naive. His mouth curved into an ironic smile, Marco's typical ironic smile. Then he takes a little red book out of his bag, and the red book was in reality a freshly printed copy of the International Journal of Comparative Labor Law and Industrial Relations. Maybe better, the journal, or Marco's new Ferrari. That year, 1999, he was appointed as managing editor of the journal. I prefer to let him speak in this case and not to put my words in his mouth. So here's a brief selection of quotation from his editorials. Issue number 1, spring 1999. The publisher has offered me to take over this function, which I have accepted with mixed feeling of sadness about Lemmy's condition, Lemmy Batten, and excitement for the task ahead. Basically, 3 generations of scholars will cooperate in a collegial style, although with different responsibilities. I am particularly delighted to welcome the junior members who will bear the major burden in the editorial process. The new editorial office will inevitably play a fundamental role, and I wish them all the best. I quote now from issue number 2, summer 1999. I've asked a number of colleagues, mostly from the editorial board, to comment on this agreement, which was the framework agreement on fixed-term work signed by the social partners at the EU level. Concluding in the context of the Maastricht Social Chapter, this international commentary reflects the very nature of this journal, a forum for promoting exchanges of views on real events taking place in the global field of labor law and industrial relations. Then a quotation from issue number 3, autumn 1999. This issue represents a sort of bridge between the scientific community and the world of policy maker in the field of labor law and industrial relations. This is the first experiment of combining the points of view of scholars and those who work at the technical level for their governments. Lastly, a quotation from issue number 3, autumn 2001. The editorial board has decided that all pieces submitted to the journal are subjected to a process of review under the control of the editorial board. This means that a refereeing process will take place and all articles will go through a peer review. 2001. 1999-2002 in a nutshell. The second thing Marco Biagi taught me in those days was enthusiasm, courage, and ability to face new challenges with forward-looking decision, able to respect academic tradition, not forgetting the past, and at the same time to generate concrete innovation, starting from academia and going through policy-making processes. And this is a really crucial issue, even nowadays. But I was requested to give a keynote speech, and I don't want to fail in my duty and responsibility. So our conference is going to focus on work beyond the pandemic towards
You only have 6 minutes.
a human-centered recovery. The immediate human and economic costs of COVID-19 are without any doubt severe, and they threaten to scale back years of progress on reducing global poverty and inequality and further damage social cohesion and global cooperation. And then, Ukraine crisis aside, we are all going to face with other impactful long-term risks, climate action failure, environmental damage, biodiversity loss, and so on. So firstly, I'm asking myself if there is a need or if it is necessary now to change the scope of labor law. My first answer is no. But in a new scenario, new opportunities, ideas, and research paths are emerging, and I sincerely hope the conference will serve as a landmark for future discussion and real strategy to cope with reforms, policy design, and innovations in Italy, in Europe, and all over the world. To put it simply, labor law is in a way of regulating life. Life of people, life of companies, life of public institutions, and private actors. Then there is a concrete risk for labor regulation of being rigid, poor, or useless in relation to the future needs of workers, companies, institutions, and social partners. To minimize these risks, interdisciplinary approaches are fundamental, and I think we are going to have important contribution to this end from different disciplines in these 2 days of conference. But that is also to say we probably should try to fruitfully reconceptualize our old ideas from the past for the post-pandemic world. Innovations are in fact a rupture with the past, but make headway thanks to the reaffirmation of a certain continuity with what has gone before. And from this point of view, I think the promotion of labor laws as vehicles for social reform is a point of no return from the history of law, a legacy of the Weimar period. And that is to say, quoting Hugo Sinsheimer, the founding father of German, Italian, and I would say European labor law, that social law is an equal law. It favors the weak over the strong. It contradicts the abstract ideal of equality of purely liberal legal to balance our material inequality. And this reaffirmation is an essential methodological indication of the importance to build a human-centered system of law after the pandemic. Then I'm asking myself if public resources to be invested for the future of work are going to be a problem. I'm also thinking about the Emanuele's presentation. My answer is yes and no. And here's an important point I would like to focus on. The European reaction to COVID-19 crisis has increased the possibility of public expenses. Nonetheless, the persistence of the economic instability and the rapid collapse of geopolitical situation highlights alarming perspective for the future of public investment in employment policies. While new dimensions of fragmentation, fragility, and vulnerability emerge in the labor market, and come out besides the more traditional ones. Women's participation in the labor market, migrant and refugees needs, and chronically ill workers. In short, the COVID-19 crisis has made the need for innovation to address mismatches and segmentation within the labor market more even pressing. Making active labor market policy efficient and sustainable is a challenge due to the fact that public finances cannot meet the increase of new labor and societal needs in terms of salaries, rising levels of unemployment, poverty, and social exclusion, among others. European institutions have recognized the urgency to foster alternative sources of labor market policies and welfare funding, supporting schemes that connect public, private, and third sectors. More in general, the debate on sustainable investment is heated all over the world. And for instance, a discussion is open on the compatibility of sustainable economy and especially ESG or impact investing with the duties of corporation and their institutional shareholders. Within this scenario, and I think we have to explore all the possibilities to build up labor market and welfare policies through social investment and financial innovation. And this is for sure an open field of policy making for experts of all kinds. And moreover, this trend towards a sustainable finance is happening in the absence of a framework capable of facing the specificity of social impact investing, and the so-called social taxonomy is very, very weak. The development of this kind of financial products requires operational criteria that are highly complex in terms of legal structure, number of actors involved, design, and outcomes evaluation. This frame has meaningful consequences, and the unexplored framework in which impact investing takes place entails a serious risk of social washing as a result of the uncertainties in terms of monitoring tools and remedies available in case of non-compliance with social obligation. Labor law could have a key role in this field. I mean labor law as a tool for a fair and social regulation of sustainable finance. Lastly, I'm asking myself if digitalization could change things for the better. As we all know, the pandemic boosted digital transformation, but also increased potential productivity for specific sectors, jobs, and occupation. This trend is going to be intensified by the recovery framework, where digital transition is one of the key pillars. And this trend will make digital skills increasingly necessary at all levels, while new skills and training needs are emerging. In short, digital in a broad sense, competence in a broad sense is a fundamental challenge for social growth and economic development now and in the future. And all of these aspects will have a relevant impact affecting labor law and both the supply and demand sides of the labor market. What is important here is the possibility for all of us to explore new links and connections between education, lifelong learning, work in a broad sense, upskilling, reskilling paths, and welfare support. And to this end, we probably need first to create digital public spaces to collect data, figures for integrated analysis using the capacity of computational system to find, access, interoperate, and reuse data with known or minimal human intervention, and this is quite paradoxical. But in short, it is going to be a matter of building bridges between different worlds. Public institutions and social partners should play a pivotal role to challenge the risks of a non-human post-pandemic reality. I'd like to conclude quoting Marcos' foreword of the book Job Creation and Labor Law, 2000. Labor law has a unique opportunity to regulate the new economic context. Its survival depends on how quickly it will be able to take on new challenges. It is really a question of adapting or dying. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Riccardo, for having done two things. First of all, offered us a sort of authentic approach to Marco. and to the way Marco would deal with problems. And secondly, having shown us the need of public investment, which of course will raise big problems with the still neoliberal thinkers which are around, you know. So we will have to fight for this in the future, but I'm totally with you and I agree with you. Well, Iacopo is the last speaker.
Thank you, good afternoon.
Thank you
Okay,
very
well,
much.
thanks, and thanks to, especially to the colleagues in the scientific committee for entrusting me with this responsibility, for which I'm very honored and humbled. In my presentation, I will try to propose a reflection on the relationship between sustainability and social dialogue, and I will start by adopting the analytical perspective of transitional labor markets. This is a theory elaborated by Gunther Schmidt more than 1 decade ago. And in this presentation, I will focus in particular on the dimension of in-work transitions. By in-work transitions, I refer to the transitions that start while an employment relationship is still in place, and that may either end up in the same company, in a different occupation, perhaps after a period of training, or even in the same occupation, or may lead to the external labor market. The first point that I will address is the concept of sustainability, and I will try in this sense to elaborate the first elements of a normative definition of the concept, which for us, as for me at least as a labor lawyer, I believe is of crucial importance. I distinguish two kinds of in-work transitions, exogenous and endogenous, depending on the origin of the factor that triggers a transition, but given the time constraints, which our chair has made us well aware of, I will only focus on the exogenous transitions, namely on company restructuring, and I will then conclude by offering some considerations and caveats on how to ensure that social dialogue can play, and Riccardo was just mentioning this point, a meaningful regulatory role in the transitions, while reaffirming, on the other hand, the principle that social dialogue cannot be the justification for a simple discharge of responsibilities from the state. Now, the concept of sustainability, we all know, is key in the contemporary policy narrative on the future of work, considering in particular the recent European strategies, the recovery funds, and so on. Several sources indicate that human-centered recovery is a process grounded in sustainability. I quote some of these sources, but I will skip them because I assume that they are well known to the majority of this audience. The point is, the nature of these sources is mostly political and not binding. As I said, as lawyers, we need to move one step forward and elaborate on a normative definition of sustainability. In my opinion, this normative definition should be based on at least two grounds. The first ground is social rights, so an effective protection from risk. We all know social rights are meant as instruments that are activated as external supports in case of needs that affect the person of the worker, like a loss of employment, health conditions, personal and family situations, and the like. And again, it was mentioned by the colleagues who spoke before me that we are in an era of transitions with new risks and new vulnerabilities that emerge, and in this sense, the perspective of social rights is of utmost importance. The second element, Chiara was mentioning it in her presentation, is quality of jobs. in my construction, quality is a function of the freedom of the worker to govern the transition. This is, well, I can just tell it as a postulate. I cannot explain it. It has, of course, to do with the fact that transitions are personal events on one side, from one perspective, and so there is no one-size-fits-all ideal model of how to manage transitions during life course that involves also personal situations. Now, I will not go deep into the explanation of the theory of transitional labor markets on the reasons why I think that this theory is capable of catching appropriately the normative elements of sustainability that I advocate. In this slide, I want just to mention and to emphasize two elements. First of all, transitions, as I said, are, well, it's an umbrella category that encompasses several situations, but mostly transitions are regulated on the grounds of sharing risks between public and private players. In fact, most of the instruments that are put in place to support workers during transitions are financed by a mix of insurance schemes, so contributions from employers and workers, and also transfers from the government, at least in the European model. And my presentation is mostly focused on the European social model as a background. Second element, in-work transitions affect or have to do mainly with sectoral and workplace issues that are an inherent competence, a traditional competence of social dialogue that can be conceived by institutions as a regulatory resource, but there is also a fundamental rights context in which we can frame the role of social dialogue in this context. So, coming to company restructuring, I will focus in particular on special instruments that is constructed to deal with in-work transitions and with company restructuring in particular, which is the instrument of short-time work schemes. Again, Chiara was mentioning this instrument in her presentation. It's an instrument that is established in several European jurisdictions with different names, Kurzarbeit in Germany, Cassa Integrazione Guadagni in Italy, and so on. Of course, there are differences with regard to the rules on functioning, so the conditions for the eligibility, the coverage, and so on. But basically, regardless of the differences, these schemes consist in the temporary interruption or in the reduction of work hours in case of market-related events that hit the company, with the loss of wages being compensated by an external subsidy. The COVID pandemic has triggered a massive use of these instruments, even in countries that did not have this instrument in their toolkit before, and has also triggered a general rethinking of the systemic role of the instruments in the social security framework. The directions for this systemic change are, well, I want just to emphasize two of this list. The first one is the universalization, so the enlargement of the scope of these schemes that were traditionally limited to certain sectors or certain companies, the companies who mostly employed a minimum threshold of workers. The other element is the differentiation from the so-called functional equivalents, so other instruments that, such as the short-time work schemes, permit to handle a temporary reduction of the volume of work with, for instance, resorting to working time accounts or to layoffs and so on. The competitiveness of one functional equivalent against another depends on, of course, economic convenience, so on whether the costs are charged on employers or on the government, for instance, on the intensity of obligations imposed on the beneficiaries, for instance, the obligation to attend training while benefiting, while receiving this support means. So what can social dialogue do? What is actually social dialogue doing to accompany the reconfiguration of short-time work schemes? In many systems, first element is the authorization and control. In many systems, short-time work schemes can be activated only prior consultation or agreement with the trade unions or workers' representative bodies, and this is, of course, a guarantee of a democratic control on the use of this system, on the fact that these schemes are also used in the interest of the workers. So it has to do with the quality element of the legal definition of sustainability. On the other hand, social partners can expand the coverage of these schemes by means of bilateral funds that can either supplement the government transfers or cover, like in the Italian case, cover sectors that are not directly covered by the state. So this has to do with the social right element. And also social dialogue can set up and manage instruments like training schemes that, as I said, are a necessary integration of the simplest forms of income support targeted to enhancing the effectiveness of the scheme and to ensure a positive and effective transition. There is a case, an example that I mentioned in this slide. I will not refer to it because I think that I only have 4 or 5 minutes.
No, less.
Less? Okay, so I will,
Yeah.
I will run to the conclusion. Okay, so what are the caveats, the limitations regarding this role of social dialogue? First of all, there is a problem of accountability. Who is accountable for delivering on social rights? Ensuring the social rights in the European social model, I believe, is a primary responsibility of the state, and this should not be forgotten. Then market interest, social dialogue alone is not a guarantee that transitions will not be driven by market interests, because we know that market interests can dominate social dialogue depending on the state of power relations. So there is a duty on the state to guide and support social dialogue in this area. Several leverages can be used, for instance, statutory requirements to steer the players towards positive behavior, like the activation of beneficiaries, the compulsory participation in training, the definition of the training programs in the interest also of the general employability of the worker, and not only in the interest, short-sighted interest of the productive needs of the company that provides or supports economically the training. Finally, the effectiveness, so the quality dimension, the empowerment of worker. Of course, social dialogue should be supported by the legal machinery that makes sure, you know, that the legal instruments can be used correctly, but this is not the only point. I think that there is also a need, an opportunity to reflect on which industrial relations instruments are best suited to handle the problems of transitions, and I think that there is a strong case here to explore complementarities between collective bargaining and participation. Participation is probably more effective. Yeah, I'm over, and my conclusive plea is a plea towards a shift to a procedural regulation that may be a best instrument to accommodate these multifaceted and individual needs of companies and the workers in transitions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Iacopo, and thanks, by the way, to all the speakers for having shown an enormous discipline in timekeeping, you know, which is good for my heart. Well, I'm fully with you, Iacopo, but there's one additional element which we have now introduced in Germany and which works very well, namely to combine this procedure with training in the time which is supposed to be free time now in these short time patterns, which works quite well. Okay, now we have started a bit later, which means that we have now approximately a quarter of an hour for discussion. Now it's your turn in the audience, but just a second. I'm not sure whether we have a microphone, so you might have to come to the microphone here. I'm sorry. But this should be possible. Okay, you start, please. Ah, here is one. Here is one. Please say your name, where you come from, and so on. It's... Ralph, come here. Okay.
Okay, Ralph Rokowski, University of Warwick.
Louder.
Okay, I have a question to on the paper on vulnerability and chronically ill workers. First, actually, I have two questions. First question is the link of the notion of vulnerability to disability. I mean, we have a long tradition of regulation of disability and rights to disabled employees. Do we talk here about a new sort of legal perspective on vulnerable workers, or can we use the existing disability regulations? So what I have in mind is when you talk about climate diversity as a response, a need for climate diversity in the organization, that is now the big question, what this climate diversity should look like. The message of the paper was that dealing with chronic illness is actually left to the worker, to the employee, to do something about it and deal with the chronic illness. Now, when we couch this in terms of disability, there are certain rights and certain demands that can be made on the organization to take into account this disability. Now, what does climate diversity mean? That's actually my main question. What are the organizational implications to deal with chronic illness? Do we have a new understanding that there's a right of the employee for flexible working conditions? I understand what Iacopo was talking about, a need for procedures, employee representatives to be involved that can be turned to demand flexibility in case of chronic illness that can then support chronically ill people. Are there long-term programs that need to be introduced, and how will they be designed? There's certainly then a room for social dialogue. So all the questions now, what does climate diversity mean also in legal perspective now as a response to chronic illness?
Silvia, do you want to respond?
As you wish.
Yes, please. Come. I don't know whether it works with this microphone.
Okay, thank you. A lot of questions, not only one.
Make it short, please.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. First of all, related to the link with disability, of course, we can learn a lot from what has already been done in terms of protections and flexibility, providing flexibility for people with disability and workers with disability, although there are really important differences that we should take into account. And probably the first one is that most chronic ill workers are silenced, okay? Company do not know that they exist. So, for example, the results that I showed, it's not a paper really, there are only some preliminary evidences, are based on 700 chronically ill workers that are enrolled in a company with 60,000 employees. Italy, okay? It's probably a very small proportion. They voluntarily participated to this research, but for sure there will be a lot of workers, other workers, who did not respond to the survey and did not participate to the focus groups. And as I said, almost 100 of these 600 never disclosed their illness, okay? And during focus group, when collecting qualitative data, we understood that they didn't disclose because they don't want to be considered as workers with disability, okay? So they don't want to be stigmatized, they don't want to have access to flexible work arrangements, to teleworking, or also any other kind of types of accommodations. So I think that's why I also emphasize the concept of climate for inclusion related to illness, because, or diversity climate, because that's what we measure. Because of course, within that company, nobody was talking about this issue, okay? So this was something not existing in human resource management department policies. So probably what we should start doing is talking about it, and that's what that company is doing now. So they are starting to talk about it. They are providing some information, and they also proposed a new role within the HR department. It's called HR business partner with art, okay, business partner with cuore. So something saying, okay, there are specific professionals who are going to support this kind of workers. So when having whatever health problems, they can go there and start understanding what are the paths that they can use within the company in terms of supports and kind of.
I think.
Okay.
Thank you. Further questions? If not, I have one. Rüdiger. Rüdiger doesn't allow me to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Manfred, sorry for that. Rüdiger Krause, University of Göttingen, Germany. I have a question to Iacopo's presentation. As I've got it right, you try to combine or to link the topic or the goal of sustainability and social dialogue. Do you focus only on social sustainability, and is it possible also to enlarge your approach to, well, environmental aspects, or is there perhaps the risk that social dialogue at company level or at sectoral level is focused more on the, let's say, the progress of or the prosperity and the success of the enterprise on the one side and the workers on the other side, and other aspects, in particular, well, the public interest of environmental problems is a bit neglected if only particular partners have their social dialogue. Is there, from another perspective, possible or at least advisable to say we must include other actors in the field which pursue this interest on their own, beyond the traditional forms of social dialogue?
May I, before giving you the floor, link my little question to Riccardo. Riccardo, I fully agree with what you said about the need of public investment. And in particular, if we listen to Rüdiger and we want to include the environment, don't you think we have to go further and ask ourselves whether we can leave the decision on what to produce to the companies? Or shouldn't this also be decided by public authorities? Iacopo.
Yes, well, thank you, Rüdiger, for your question. I think this is an open issue. Concept of in-work transitions, as I try to assume it, define it, includes also the so-called green transitions. So there is a possibility that a transition takes place to accompany a sort of a green structuring, so taking into account also the interests of environment to move to a less polluting production system or organization and so on. Of course, it depends on the what the players put on the table, bargaining table, because of creating a dialogue, and as I advocate in my presentation, mainly on the steering action from the state. If the state invests money on green restructuring, then there is also the possibility to combine in this concept of sustainability, environmental and social issues, although I believe that the concept of sustainability is a conflictual concept. It's a concept that tries to accommodate conflicted dimensions. So in the end, it's also a political question on whether the outcome is more towards the economy, social, environment, while a nihilist.
Riccardo.
I think risks of greenwashing and social washing are enormous. And so I think the role of public authorities is going to be fundamental. And by this way, for the role of social partners and employee association and employee association. So the public authorities as a medium for this kind of problem. The risk of green washing and social washing.
Thank you. Carl? Here. Tommaso, please.
One very brief question for Silvia again. I was wondering why you conclude with the need for what you called bottom-up HRM practices.
Good. The Olympics are over, Tommaso.
Yeah, we went quite in depth into the topic, analyzing the way flexible work arrangements like remote working, flex time were introduced. And we found out that basically we analyzed some teamworks where these practices were introduced. And we found out that the practices were effective, and so chronically ill workers decided to adopt this practice and were happy in working in this new way when or they were the ones initiating the practice, or when they were setting partnership with their supervisors or their co-workers in initiating the practice. So there was really not a top-down approach, but a bottom-up. So they were the ones within the team who decided how to settle down the new ways of working, given some, for example, temporary disabilities, and they were proposing the HR department these new ways of working in agreement with the team. This way, this was what I meant with bottom-up approach.
Thank you very much. I would say, if we look at this opening session, we can say that this was a promising beginning of this conference. I would like to thank again to the 5 speakers who not only gave us important information, but who, as I already said, showed enormous discipline, which is a sort of model for the sessions to come. We will now have a short break, and then we will have 2 parallel sessions. You find it in the program, and you also find the rooms where they take place. One of them takes place here, and I would like to ask you to be there at, now it's just a little bit after 4 o'clock, so you should be there around 4:15, and then we have enough time to discuss in these parallel sessions. Thank you very much.